Does US media have an issue with Japanese video game developers? What is going on with all of these clips surfacing from 15, 20 years ago that is outright brutally mocking JRPGs? Is JRPG a bad term now that we need to retire? Today, we will be going into all of this and more as we explore just what the heck happened in US media and the treatment towards Japanese content. The conversation recently started up with Yoshi-P, aka Naoki Yoshida, visionary behind Final Fantasy XIV. Recently, in an interview with Skill Up, he said that when the term JRPG first appeared 15 years ago, many of his fellow developers felt like they were being made fun of and were being discriminated against. There has definitely been a rocky history of treatment towards the Japanese in American media. So to kick it off, as with any good juicy controversy, here is my favorite man in the world, Adam Sessler, in clips from his review of Baten Kaitos Origins in 2006 for the GameCube on GeForce XPlay.
All right, the story. Let me guess. There's probably a young hero with some sort of memory problem who's fighting a vastly overwhelming Evo fascio magical empire. Cliché burden boy of action who will save us all is named Sagi. Rhymes with Saki. Saki! Which I could use a lot of right now.
Sagi!
Saki! And apparently nothing says prequel like improved breath physics on the shopkeepers.
Sagi!
Sake!
Sagi!
Saki! Will you shut up about Sagi?
Sagi!
Saki! 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 Baten Kaitos Origin is an RPG for the GameCube. That about says it all.
Oh man. Adam Sessler himself, and this surprised me, on Twitter isn't backing off either. Here are the facts. This kind of humor was considered acceptable enough on cable television in 2006. XPlay had a running gag of making fun of Japanese video games, which we have covered here. And finally, Japanese games and anime were considered a very easy punching bag in media. This is how a lot of cheap shock humor is crafted. Determine a group of people that you're willing to sacrifice, that is easily offended, that society does not care about you crapping on. XPlay picked Japanese video game fans. If you can outrage these people into participating and hate watching, even better. According to Adam Sessler himself, this is exactly what XPlay did.
I'll watch a movie that I know I'm going to hate just so I can hate it afterwards.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people, and I think that's a legitimate way to consume media.
I mean, look, at the end of the day, a view is a view is a view is a view.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, I mean, there is a point where in order to keep ratings going, if I needed to plead myself a little, okay, let's do it.
Okay, I highly doubt Yoshi-P imported and watched GeForce XPlay of all trash shows, and that this Baten Kaitos review has stuck with him all this time. What I do want to say though is that this type of sentiment, although presented as a joke in this context, did not occur within a vacuum. There was very clearly an anti-Asian and anti-Japanese sentiment carried by a large number of people in the 90s, 2000s, and beyond, even to today. If they aren't being outright condemned, they are being heavily mocked, oftentimes. Some of the people guilty of this were journalists and even people of the industry itself. Just as a quick aside, if you like this kind of meta video game commentary, make sure to hit that subscribe button. And remember, I love it when you comment, I read everything, and I find it fascinating. So, here's Phil Fish, developer of Fez, at the Game Developers Conference in 2012. It's a big name conference for industry professionals that takes place yearly in California.
Could you tell me what you think about the recently Japanese game?
Is it what is about Japanese games that inspired us?
Recent.
Most recent Japanese
I'm sorry.
They suck. I'm sorry. Like, you guys need to get with the times.
So isn't that some verbal diarrhea for you? I remember at the time thinking, man, well, he just went and did the thing. It's not like the sentiment wasn't already there in the media. He just said it out loud. A little bolder than most, and in an incredibly unprofessional way. For further reinforcement, here's Jonathan Blow from the same conference. I think he was trying to clean up some of the message. However, it goes to show that Phil is not alone in some of the feelings that he had.
I have a more specific game design comment that is
So hateful. Swoop in and be constructive.
No, this is well, I mean, I don't like Japanese games either. The thing that I don't like about them, all the modern ones that I've played, except, you know, like Dark Souls and Demon Souls and stuff, is you sit down and the game treats you like an idiot, right? Like you have to click through like 700 little boxes telling you how to do everything. There's this idea, so Western game designers, and I'm only familiar with the game design dialogue in the West, but old school games like adventure games had all this random stuff where you had to read the designer's mind, right? And at some point we understood, oh, things have to kind of make sense for the player to expect to get through them, right? So we have to train people on our game mechanics, and then the rest of the game can be expanded out from that initial training, right? I feel like Japanese games take that too far, and Japanese games feel like it's illegal to ever let the player do anything that has not explicitly been shown to the player in painstaking detail earlier in the game. And what that does is it kills the joy of discovery. And that's the thing that I really value about games, is when you figure something out that you haven't been shown, right? And when you show the player everything, you're turning it into an exercise, and it's an exercise that's kind of insulting, because of course I can follow the exercise, you told me what to do, right? And then they make me click through so much bad dialogue. I mean, Western game dialogue is terrible also, but at least we hit spacebar and we can like skip the whole cutscene or whatever. But when they come in and make you hit A, yeah.
All right, before we start labeling these people, for the sake of argument, is there any legitimacy to the idea that Japanese video games were in a slump at the time? We're being incredibly charitable here, but I think it's worth going through the exercise just to further iterate our point. The answer is they weren't really in a slump. Sure, with titles like Skyrim and Deus Ex Human Revolution, yes, the West was dominating in massive budget, cutting-edge games. But that's not all of what's being discussed here. We are talking about ingenuity, creativity, innovation, and just good quality video games. And Japan was still delivering at this time. And The Legend of Zelda: Skyward Sword, with its beginning slowness, does not represent the entire output of the country, nor is it even bad if some games are a little slow up front and a little hangouty. The Legend of Zelda: Twilight Princess was actually praised for some of these qualities just a few years earlier. There was an anti-Japanese sentiment that existed at that time. It is a vibe that I and many others felt all over the place. What I would like to explore is, how did we get here? There has been a base level of anti-Japanese acceptability that I have seen my entire life. We are going super fast over an incredibly complex topic here, but stick with me. World War II ended in 1945, where Japan was one of the adversaries of the United States. Following the war, there was a major rivalry in industry as well, particularly in car manufacturing. By the time the 90s rolled around, it's not like young people at the time could articulate why some of our grandparents were not as kind toward the Japanese in their speech, or any Asians for that matter, but there was a foundation of othering that had occurred. I remember conversations with friends at the time asking them why their parents insisted on only buying American cars or American motorcycles. I don't remember any of my young friends actually having a clear reason why. It was just sort of the way things were. Simultaneously, and this is interesting, in the 80s and 90s, Japan also started to become considered exotic and cool with the youngest generation. Young kids didn't yet realize that Nintendo and all the greatest developers at the time for the system were Japanese, but cartoons started to lean into some interesting aspects of Japanese culture. The cartoon for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which came out in 1987, set the kid world on fire. Ninjas were suddenly considered awesome. The TMNT arcade game dominated arcades, and when you were playing with friends, it was common to pretend to be the Ninja Turtles. 1990's live-action Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie directly hit kids in the head with Splinter and Shredder's backstory, explicitly calling out these Japanese inspirations. Suddenly, ninjas started appearing everywhere, with classic movies such as 1992's Three Ninjas and 1993's Surf Ninjas, all capitalizing on the success. Prior to Ninja Turtles, Gen X had already been primed a little bit with Karate Kid, X-Men with some of the stories taking place in Japan, and a few anime shows such as Star Blazers, Robotech, and Speed Racer. The seeds were getting planted in the mid-1990s. Video game magazines were forthright in their coverage of games like Final Fantasy, Street Fighter, and Mega Man, all being of Japanese origin. Chrono Trigger, especially with the beautiful artwork by Akira Toriyama, got us especially primed for the future. Shout out personally to Lunar the Silver Star for the Sega CD, which got me and a few others fascinated with the Japanese art style. At this time, although I am hyping these properties a lot because I love them, you still couldn't come out strong in public in loving Japanese media to the majority of people without facing some kind of backlash for being weird. Video games, Ninja Turtles, and cartoons were all something that you were still supposed to be grown out of by the time you hit high school, if not middle school. Outside of just a few other nerds, liking anything known to be of a foreign origin was considered strange, and people would think that you were defective. This default position of othering media from a foreign country was still very prevalent. Even among my fellow strange people at the time, I remember a few separate instances where someone surely should have been more open to not crapping on anime, and yet they sure did. There was a time in early 1997 where I admitted to liking anime, which was mainly just Dragon Ball at the time. The girl that I was talking to, who self-identified as goth, started thinking and asking me if I was into ultra-violent SA cartoons, and then she started treating me as strange. At that point, besides a few shows on TV, anime was known in some circles as being major degenerate content based on what was curated in the Blockbuster section, where there were about 12 tapes labeled as definitely not for kids, and then what used to show on the Sci-Fi Channel on Saturday mornings. Anime, even in the very beginning, had a bad name. Moving on, 1997 planted the next seed of potential acceptance. Out of nowhere, Japanese RPGs became a selling point, and the cinematic qualities of games like Final Fantasy VII had never been seen prior. People bragged that this was a game that was so heartfelt that it could make you cry. This was coming out with other big titles like Resident Evil and Metal Gear Solid at this time. Pokemon started airing on American television this year, although the initial audience for Pokemon was much younger, and so those seeds didn't start to germinate into appreciating Japanese anime until a little later. Japan fever exploded in 1998. Cartoon Network took a chance in creating the Toonami block, buying the rights to a bunch of shows for cheap and airing them all daily right after school in prime time. Dragon Ball Z, Sailor Moon, Ronin Warriors, Gundam Wing, Outlaw Star, and a whole bunch of other shows started airing in the most desirable block of time that you could possibly hope for on American television. Because the US had never seen anything remotely like this all at once, a phenomenon occurred. Anime became the it thing, and the industry exploded in popularity. Suddenly, the cool punk rock kids and the biggest of nerds all had at least something in common, and that was that they were occasionally wearing Dragon Ball t-shirts, and they could bond over their love of Final Fantasy X. It is my theory that the explosion in Japanese popularity at this time really pissed off a lot of people. With the 2000s rolling in, you started to see a major pushback to Japan. Final Fantasy and turn-based combat was for arrested developmental children. Anime was degenerate trash, and the plot lines were all creepy, and you must be creepy for being able to enjoy any of it. The sentiment was that the Japanese don't know how to make good stories, all anime and manga art styles look the same, and so on. With this major emphasis on Japanese culture, it inspired many people to try to learn the language at this time. There was message board post after message board post trashing anime fans for wanting to learn the language for the wrong reasons. If someone happened to be both an anime fan and autistic and taking a class in Japanese, they were treated as if they were subhuman. The mid-2000s saw the pushback of everything that was gained just prior. At this time, I was taking classes for graphic design. There were a lot of people interested in the arts, and they were all hanging out. I had several teachers from the Boomer and Gen X generation who outright scorned Japanese anime, didn't understand it, didn't want to understand it, called it trash, and did not want any of it to inspire any of the work that we did in our classes. This goes beyond just expanding our horizons. Trust me, these were old school American comic book fans who wanted nothing to do with anything out of Asia, unless it was maybe an old school kung fu film, and even then, probably only to make fun of it. We were all enthusiastic about the 3D revolution in animation that was occurring at that time, but if you brought up the Final Fantasy XIII trailer, that just wasn't considered a good move. You needed to be drooling more for Pixar, or even Transformers. I remember getting into an argument once with a teacher about how Japanese art did not all look the same. I'm referencing Dragon Ball, Sailor Moon, Clamp, JoJo, Berserk, and just going down the list, but he wasn't having it. I even pointed out that Japanese art often includes the American style, just not for the main character, but oftentimes for villains or particularly mean soldier types. Keep your eyes open. You see it all the time. This did not go over well. There was a real anti-Japanese sentiment that took place from art people, even the oddball graphic design types, in the real world. At that time, you did not want to admit to liking anime or anything particularly Japanese on any nerd-related message board that wasn't specifically catering itself towards anime or Japanese role-playing games. Like we just talked about, G4 was trashing Japan across the network despite ripping off some of its aesthetics at the same time, which was weird. Video game developers were not speaking pleasantly on Japan, including the founder of BioWare stating that JRPGs suffered a lack of evolution. These are the type of people that were posting on the aforementioned message boards. The most fringe of content was often getting dragged out and crapped on frequently, as if it represented everything. Even outlets that were inspired by anime or covered anime exclusively started to showcase this weird self-hating vibe, as if they were ashamed of the content that they were covering. It was almost surreal just how often that this occurred. This is probably what Yoshi-P picked up on. It's this simultaneous acceptance to some degree, but major trashing of Japanese content at large that likely did it. While there has been some increased acceptance, and gamers of all kind love Elden Ring, Final Fantasy XIV, and Nintendo products, even in pro-Japanese spaces today, there can be an undercurrent of Americans putting down Japanese content. A lot of localization philosophy aims to strip and rewrite Japanese media to convey intention as according to American standards. It always disturbs me when Japanese media is called out for not being American media. It is common for artists to have a disdain for being boxed into one category and then further boxed into a more limited category as time goes on. I used to listen to a radio program growing up that would interview bands up to 5 times a week, and almost all of the punk rockers, when asked about being punk rock, would immediately disown the label and start preaching about how they just make music and it's other people that put the punk label on them. It was always like, okay, we get it, but we gotta sort your band somewhere in the store. In video games, with Japanese literally being in the name of the subgenre, it probably stands out a little more, especially to the Japanese. They are probably used to the mouthpieces within American media being negative towards their work. It is fully understandable that some of them may have issues with what has occurred. It's interesting to note that Yoshi-P referenced first hearing this 15 years ago. The term has been around on some level since the mid-90s, showing up in video game magazines in the late 90s, and it became particularly popular during the PlayStation 2 era, which started in the year 2000. The time frame Yoshi-P references is when JRPGs were at their lowest in terms of gamer cultural acceptance. It's definitely possible that Yoshi-P didn't think his statement would get this level of analysis, but it's interesting in the idea that he may have learned the term a little bit later on when American media was getting even worse. To me, the term JRPG has utility. I remember when JRPGs started to become a thing as opposed to Western RPGs, and I was slightly annoyed that my favorite genre just became a subgenre, but it made sense. At the end of the day, the descriptor works, and you know exactly what you're going to get. We can split hairs over what Dark Souls is supposed to be categorized, but no one I know is going to start listing off that series as one of their favorite JRPGs in an honest conversation. Seriously. I think the term is going to stick around. I suppose we'll see. But if that goes away, what about the terms J-pop and K-pop? And are we going to be able to keep saying anime in reference to purely animation of Japanese origin? So let me know what you think on this topic and what you think about the term JRPGs. There are aspects of this video that touch topics that I am extremely passionate about, and I do not like the stigma that Japanese media has had attached to it for so long, and all of the negative associations attached to the people who make and enjoy it. I'm all about joking, having fun, but there's a real disdain that is under the surface that I wish could change. I could go on hour after hour in this video just further digressing into each and every point, but we had to get something out here that was remotely coherent. I want to thank you all for watching this video. Make sure you subscribe, comment, like it, and I'll see you next time.